May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. I was asked last week why I had my cell phone up here, and they were worried that maybe I was getting a call right in the middle of the service. I just want you to know that we've started to record the sermons, and that's what I use my cell phone for, so nobody's trying to get in touch with me on my cell phone at this point in time. I wonder how many of you remember a movie from 1999 that was called The Sixth Sense. Some of you are nodding. In that movie, Bruce Willis played a child psychologist, and he decided that he was going to help a boy. The boy, by the way, was played by an actor named Haley Joel Osment. And the boy tells Willis that he sees dead people. That's the line I most remember from that movie, by the way. I see dead people. And then the boy goes on further to explain that the dead people don't really know they're dead. And the boy doesn't know what how he's supposed to deal with them. Well, Willis finally suggests that the boy ought to try and help them whenever he encounters them. And so they go together and they help the family of whose little daughter had died. And later, as they're talking together, the boy suggests to Willis that he ought to talk to his wife while she is sleeping that night. And so that's what Willis does. He speaks to his wife while she's asleep. And as he starts to talk to her and realizes the things that she's doing, he finally comes to the understanding that he is one of those dead people that the boy has encountered. He was killed by a gunshot wound. And he ends up telling his wife how much he loves her, and they have kind of a settling, a closure, and he's freed from this perhaps unstable state, and he goes on. He may go to heaven, presumably. We think that. By the way, the movie is considered part of the horror genre, and I never quite thought that it was a horror movie. It just wasn't what I thought. So now in the movie, Willis sees things that he interprets incorrectly. He doesn't see what's really going on, and it's only through the help of the young boy that he finally realizes what's happened. And just for you young people that are here today, remember that sometimes the young people are the ones that help us to find the real truths. We've had other movies that have a similar thing, how we can be blinded by our own understanding of the world. And we know that two people can have the exact same experience, and yet they can understand it differently, interpret it totally differently. We even use this expression that we say we see something, and yet it's not just what we see, but how our mind works and interprets what it is we've seen. And I think that can happen to us as well because we might have encounters with God, and some people may experience it a certain way and others experience it another way. Some people have a certain experience and they say they see God in that experience, and other people say it's just something that happened in their life. So today I feel this expression in the Scriptures today that we have some people that we encounter in Scriptures that aren't certain exactly what's going on. And I wonder if we might consider that in our own lives as well. So for example, in the Gospels, the apostles often didn't understand what was going on. Jesus was fond of saying, especially in the Gospel of Mark, "Are you ever going to get it?" And I like that because it gives me a little bit of encouragement whenever I struggle with what Jesus is trying to tell us at any given point in time. Well, today we celebrate the Feast of the Transfiguration. Actually, the Feast of the Transfiguration is scheduled for Tuesday, August the 6th, just 2 days from now. But we're the Church of the Transfiguration. We get to celebrate the Transfiguration, so that's why it's been moved to this Sunday. By the way, some of you may feel like you're missing something, don't like these readings. If you really worry about this, I can share with you that in the gospel story for this day and Pentecost season, a man decided that he was going to build these huge barns to store all the goods that he had. And before he was even able to use them or put anything in them, he died. And Jesus tells everybody that the point of that story is that you're not supposed to keep treasures for yourself, but rather share your treasures in the richness of God. So there's one sermon in 1 minute for you. But today I want to focus on a couple stories where people were either uncertain or confused about what happened in an encounter with God. So the first lesson that we have is about Moses. And Moses came down from the mountain and his face was shining. Now, for his part, Moses had that experience because he encountered God up on top of the mountain. It's a little similar to the story about Jesus that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But he didn't know that his face was shining when he came down. He really only just wanted to share the commandments with the people. But he gets down to the bottom of the mountain and he encounters some folks, and all of a sudden they're afraid of him just because his face was shining. And I'm not sure why exactly they had that reaction. Maybe you've had that kind of an experience at some time in your life. You see someone who looks a little different and you're afraid. But in this case, it's kind of surprising because instead of being appreciative of the fact that Moses had gone up and encountered God, they seemed to feel almost as if Moses had done something wrong. So Moses tries to accommodate their problems by veiling his face. I guess once he veiled his face, that took away all of their concerns about what had happened up on top of the mountain. Maybe. I don't know. But isn't it sad that in that particular case, they were either uncertain or confused? They should have been happy that God was with them. God showed God's presence to them. In the gospel, then, Jesus takes 3 of his apostles up on top of the mountain, and his face was changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. And yet, when we read about this, it doesn't seem like the apostles quite understood what was going on either. When it first happened, they didn't know what to do, and then finally Peter blurts out, well, why don't we build some booths up here for you and Elijah and Moses? Nothing happens to that. In fact, what we read is that Peter said that because he didn't know what he was saying. He was confused about the important part of it. As just an aside, I sometimes think that Jesus doesn't particularly appreciate all the monuments that we might build to him, by the way. But despite their uncertainty, when Jesus was transfigured, they were changed. They were changed by that experience. They caught a glimpse of the glory of God. What it was going to be like in heaven, perhaps. And Jesus gave them a foretaste of what is to come. I think it gave them strength, and I think they would need that experience and the revelation of Jesus as God to get them through the times of trial that were to come. That's what Moses and Elijah were talking with Jesus about, what was going to happen in Jerusalem. Now, there's lots of times in Jesus' ministry when his identity was questioned. People said, "Who the heck are you?" And Jesus actually did that with his apostles. Do you remember? He said, "Who do people say that I am?" And some of them talked about different things. And Peter was the one that came up and said, "No, you are the Messiah." And yet, not long after that particular experience in the Gospel of Luke, he's up there on the mountain and he's trying to maybe make Elijah and Moses and Jesus the same. It wasn't until the voice of God was heard that they finally understood, because God told them that this is my son. And that's when the apostles finally understood what was going on. So we have these 2 kind of encounters in Scripture today where people either are uncertain, confused, or don't know how to act in the presence of God. And I wonder if it's possible that we might have that experience in our own lives sometimes. Now, when we come to this church, when we come to any church, I think you're expecting to have an encounter with God. You come so that you can have an encounter with God. We learn about God. And most especially, we have the opportunity to interact with Jesus in the communion. And yet I wonder if it's possible that other parts of our lives, in other times, we might be surprised, or maybe we're so preoccupied that we are uncertain how to respond because God showed up where we were. God was present. And so the question I ask is, how can we be more open to the presence of God in our lives? Possibly, maybe when we encounter God, be in awe of the fact that God was there, but also happy and encouraged that we can spend time with God. Now, just as the apostles were changed by the transfiguration of Jesus up on top of that mountain, I think we all wish to be transfigured, to be changed. I like to say that we want to be transformed by Jesus. And sometimes we are transformed because we had an experience and we know that it happened clearly for us. We know immediately that we had an experience with God. But I think there's other times when we're not so certain, and maybe that the encounter that we have takes a while for us to be understanding that things have happened to us. And there's one experience that I had that kind of reminds me of all that. It happened several years ago. I've talked about it before in this church. It happened on a Saturday evening when we had a confirmation. And after the confirmation, we had a reception in the parish hall. It started to get kind of dark, but not too bad. And I came back over to the church after the reception because I just wanted to make sure that the church was locked up. That's really the only reason I came back over. And I walked into the church and I looked up at the icon that's sitting right behind the altar, and it was glowing as if it were lit from within, as if the gold was just shining brightly from it. We don't often see that, that's for sure. You may never have seen it. So for me, it was a surprising visit from God. That's how I interpret it to this day. A surprising visit from God, a chance for God to say, I am present here for you, for all of you. So my encouragement for you today is that you allow your heart to be open to a time when Jesus is with you in your life. I ask you to imagine that you might enter into a place kind of just like the apostles did. They went up on that mountain. They thought they were just going to pray. And yet something special happened while they were up there. And they experienced the light of Jesus, and that we too might experience the light of Jesus shining into our hearts. And maybe on this day when we remember those who have died in mass shootings, maybe we wish that we could have that experience, that God would shine in our hearts today, shine in the hearts of so many people. And I ask you to remember that you can be changed by the experience that you have with God, that you might be transformed spiritually, that you might feel the presence of God, and that you might feel comfort that He is with you that day. You might be transformed physically. We know that that happens to people. It happened to Moses. But I'm sure that you've had times when you've looked on someone's face and you said, oh my goodness, I see the peace of God present in them. And we can be transformed mentally too, because God can be present in our lives and help us to make good decisions about what we should do. In today's epistle, it says it comes from the second letter of Peter. And either Peter wrote it or someone who really liked Peter wrote it. It's written as if it were from Peter. And whoever wrote it specifically mentions that they believe in Jesus, they shared the glory of God, and they were certain that this Jesus was God because this person had been up on top of that mountain. It's interesting to note, someone pointed this out to me the other day, that they didn't speak about the great light that came from Jesus on that day. No. What was special was that God came and said, this is my son. And because of that, I just want you to remember that your experience with God can happen in so many different ways. You ought to open all of your senses to that possibility. It might be a visual experience. It might be something spoken. It might be something that just comes to you in your heart. And perhaps we might wish, as it says in our collect today, I like those words, that we could be delivered from our disquietude. The idea that the world outside has got so much noise happening, so much terrible things going on, and yet we can be delivered from our disquietude and brought into peace with Jesus. And that is my wish for us today, that we may feel the light of Jesus flowing over us and through us. Amen.